So I'm generally not of the opinion that the notion of global blackness does much work for Africanists, with perhaps the exception of South Africa, where an almost 350-year history of white supremacy reorganized, recategorized, and redesignated people, places, and entitlements on the basis of pigment. True, across much of the rest of the continent, such racial distinctions arising from the interdigitation of histories of slavery and empire brought Africans and Europeans face to face in ways that produced new forms of race consciousness. Because while I'm not ready to think about blackness solely in terms of pigment, by its very definition, it seems to me that blackness can only be thought in its opposition to whiteness. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fennell poignantly describes the dialectic of identification through which blackness is produced by whiteness. Quote, "Look, a Negro." The circle was drawing a bit tighter. "Mama, see the Negro, I'm frightened," end quote. Black Skin, White Masks is a devastating indictment, not only for the fact of a pervasive racism reaching from Algeria to Martinique and perhaps most critically back to France, but as a full-fledged philosophical critique of the foundational European thinkers on whom Fennell relies. The problem is not only that of how the slave will liberate herself from the master, thereby resolving the dialectic for them both, but that the dialectic is faulty to begin with, that on closer scrutiny, the perpetual reassertion of white supremacy belies the promises of a total Hegelian liberation. Even as the concept of blackness is married to the concept of the global in this exercise that we're all engaging, to produce perhaps a sense of structural relations in the world, shared histories, shared discriminations, shared experiences, shared pleasures, this marrying of blackness to make blackness in the world is still predicated on uneven local histories, such that it would be difficult, for me at least, to say exactly what can be brought together by the framing of global blackness as an organizing concept. For example, the Nigerian experience of British colonial rule and the timing of its independence cannot be said to entirely parallel South Africa's both belated and compromised liberation, as well as its ongoing struggle to redefine itself after 3.5 centuries of settler colonialism. To be sure, the nation may not be the appropriate scale at which to think about shared and cross-cutting histories, but Africanists in any case persist in mobilizing the national space as probably the primary object of analysis, even as many of us are thinking transnationally and about the movements of people across borders. The same is true of several of the continent's writers, the so-called third generation, writing of what it means to be African in the world, notably not black, but African. And so I worry about the place from which global blackness is enunciated here in the American Academy ahead of what and how black people in many places might self-define, prioritize, and claim for themselves politically, setting aside the obvious ways in which race versus blackness is marked, nevertheless, everywhere. Put differently, I want to listen very carefully to the claim that someone like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie or indeed Taye Selassie make when they complicate the question of identity, the danger of a single story, or the problem of being from one particular place and hence marked as such. All that being said, this position paper tries to bring South Africa and the US into conversation as two sites in which histories of race and racism, white supremacy, and geopolitical exceptionalism have played similar, if never identical, roles in defining the concept of blackness in very specific ways. In setting the two side by side, the problem of late capitalist modernity is revealed as a problem of racism following Foucault. The founding and foundational truth of the Atlantic world, and we would do well to recall that the Atlantic has no Archimedean point, save that from which any given writer writes about it, whether the US, Europe, the Caribbean, or Africa, organizes a whole history of black life and black bodies, both vehemently acknowledged and denied for their intrinsic value to and role in establishing world markets. These are the dual problems of the afterlife of slavery and the afterlife of colonialism, that undeniable reality of the contribution of black value, black labor, black bodies to the contemporary conjuncture, what Marx understood as capital, as dead labor. Ta-Nehisi Coates grimly notes that, quote, black life is cheap, but in America, black bodies are a natural resource of incomparable value, end quote. This surely points to the central dilemma of race and racism to which claims blackness might respond, namely that black bodies represent the paradoxes, contradictions, and ambivalences of being both the source and site of tremendous surplus value and an assumed superfluity. It follows then that if we can concede that world history is black history and vice versa, that our entanglements, mobilities, circulations, and collusions provide the ground for connecting various moments in the history of race and blackness, the moment of slavery, colonialism, emancipation, renewed dispossession, transition and transformation, citing the South African experiment, failed land reform, lynching, mass incarceration, police shootings, post-apartheid disappointment, Marikana or Michael Brown. Thinking South African and US exceptionalisms demands careful, self-consciously non-linear argument in order to reveal the contradiction of valuation and devaluation, surplus and superfluity that I would contend is the ground of black experience here and there, now and then. The method of comparison has its limits, of course, and without attention to the detail of here and there, now and then, the concept of blackness will not extend as far as we might wish it to access local and global knowledges, to move beyond the exhaustion of a set of demands, to think with Coates about the spectacular breaking down of the black body, circulating as an icon, and how that affects the writing of sentiment, to finally be able to say, we must do the work of thinking here and there, now and then. So in what I like to call the time-space of the negative, which is really my thinking about South Africa, it occurs to me that we might gain momentum for the intellectual and political work we do precisely by connecting these distinct times and places in order to outline the contours of this moment in South Africa, when the disappointments and derelictions of the post-colonial condition have become altogether too clear. In other words, despite the problems of scale, distance, and possible incommensurability, we might gain important insights through comparison. We might gain insights in moving beyond the notion of exceptionalism. We might even begin to trace the world historical conditions in which Zuma, Trump, Brexit, rising white nationalist sentiments, xenophobia, the, quote, incomplete movement from slavery to freedom, end quote, to cite Christina Sharp, together denote the most monstrous intimacies of our present. And by monstrous intimacies, I mean, I refer to those daily degradations that are both so conspicuous and at the same time virtually ignored. This analytical work is what I choose to call thinking the black body in the time-space of the negative. So, I have long felt the uneasiness of the comparison between the two, precisely on grounds that minority and majority, civil rights and civil war, Jim Crow and apartheid amounted to rather different things. More recently, the resurgence of anti-black racism in the US, if unsurprising, has been not only met but anticipated in a new and virulent anti-black racism in South Africa. How such racism functions in a black majority society is eye-opening in that it returns us to the problem laid out in Black Skin, White Masks, namely the irresolution of the master-slave dialectic and Fennell's insistence on white supremacy's persistence. Evidently, then, there is something structural, world-organizing and world-destroying about the fact of race, even as I would want to caution us to be attentive to the dangers of the single story. Notably, the South African radical scholarship in the last 2 decades has seen a turn, in some quarters at least, from the long-standing and fairly predictable cleaving to neo-Marxism to an embrace of black consciousness and the writings of both Fennell and Steve Biko, not a little paradoxically at precisely the moment that many declared race and racism dead and looked instead to growing inequality, deepening poverty, and a proliferation of neoliberal policies as forcing a shift from race to class. This maps the extraordinary and meteoric rise of the Economic Freedom Fighters Party, or EFF, since 2013, and their very self-conscious declaration as both Fannonians, or neo-Bikoists, and Leninists. Yet articulating blackness as a political position remains all the same an uneven proposition that I don't feel has the same, if no less important, purchase in the South African context. In the South African student movements, namely Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall, to be sure, setting aside their contradictions, inconsistencies, and failings, the claim to an array of political positions and intersections involves, quote, working on the project of historical dissonance, of clarifying the untenable status quo of the present by forcing an awareness of a time when things are not this way. Working on the project of historical dissonance, of clarifying the untenable status quo of the present by forcing an awareness of a time when things are not this way. They have been things many have yet to see. They have been experimenting with hallucinating a new time, end quote. Young South Africans are working on multiple fronts to imagine true decoloniality, and yes, sometimes such efforts are focused on solidarities of race, but also many other kinds of solidarities and anti-solidarities too. So here there's a break in what I have to say, and I'll conclude by identifying 3 moments that I find as striking that might actually build a theory from the South. These are 3 things that happen in South Africa, interestingly, before they happen in the US context. The first is the fact of the 2008 financial crisis being anticipated in South Africa, where the emergence of subprime markets and the post-apartheid debt crisis preceded the global financial meltdown of 2008. That's the first moment. The second and third phases of social movement protests in South Africa. So this would include social movements and protest politics around service delivery, land reform, housing, and so on. And then finally, by 2015, the emergence of the campus social movements and their allying with unions. But in any case, the second and third phases of social movement protests in South Africa, beginning about 2004, the political protest capital of the world, anticipated the critical period 2010-2011, when the Arab Spring, the Spanish encampments, and Occupy began to show the world reach of responses to capitalist crisis. The third one is the prefiguring of populism, ethnic or white nationalism, resurgent anti-black racism in the time of Zuma, long before the time of Trump. These together begin to suggest that if in fact race, racism, and the political claims of blackness are world organizing, we might begin to think from somewhere beyond the places we generally look to in order to generate theory. Such a change in outlook, a shift in what we identify as the site of enunciation, might very well shift the stakes of a concept of global blackness. Thank you.
My name is Joseph Winters. I am a professor in religious studies, second year here at Duke University. First, I would like to thank Tommy DeFrantz, the Department of AAAS, my fellow panelists, and the audience. Hope you will indulge me. I'm trying to use this as an occasion to actually figure out what I actually do. Because, I mean, and honestly, sometimes these can be occasions to kind of clarify and make explicit, not only to others, but to yourself, what you do. So, before getting into kind of some of my specific interests, I want to just think about how I situate myself in African-American religious thought and Black studies. And I'm doing that because often when I tell people that's what I do, they look at me and they either say, what are you a Black theologian or are you a Black preacher? And I'm neither one of those, no disrespect to that, but right, what I'm trying to kind of think about how, right, I'm making a particular kind of contribution to Black religious thought. So I am a religionist. It's not a term that I'm really comfortable with, but that's what, right? In general, I am fascinated by how human subjects imagine, construct, and contest sacred spaces, objects, bodies, and practices. Or to put it differently, I am intrigued and at times horrified by how selves organize and disorganize life around the sacred, profane, boundary, or edge. Sacred here, just initially, is that which is set apart, that which we protect and separate with certain kinds of taboos or prohibitions, or more positively, the sacred names those sites of transcendence, ecstasy, and even experiences of rupture into the ordinary. So for me, in my work, performances of the sacred can be found in church worship, prayer at a mosque, ring shout on slave plantations, the collectively ecstatic experience at a Beyonce concert. I haven't been, but people have told me, right? A national football game where a football player's protest signifies a clash between competing conceptions of the sacred. Sacredness of black life and death, colliding with the hallowed quality of the flag, war, and nation building. So troubling any rigid or stable distinction between the sacred and profane is, for me, the sine qua non of religious studies. To study sacred value is not only to examine widely recognized religious institutions, rituals, or various systems of belief in gods and supernatural powers. As I just suggested, we find the imagination, construction, and contestation of sacred value at the edges of traditional religious institutions, the flag, nation state, commodity fetish, and Duke basketball. As a religionist, I see myself primarily working at the intersection of black religious thought, African American literature, and critical theory, broadly construed. To better articulate my approach, I think it is helpful to briefly delineate several common sense approaches within black religious thought that I have learned from, but that my project and approach departs from to some extent. As Bill Hart, Tracy Hucks, and Diana Stewart have pointed out, there has been a kind of hoary tendency within and outside of the U.S. Academy to reduce the complexities of the black religion to the black church or black Protestantism, right? Part of this is an issue of periodization, right? Often scholars begin with beginning of the 19th century, a moment, especially in the United States context, where both free and enslaved blacks came into more frequent contact with Christianity after the Great Awakenings, right? But there's, a couple centuries here where something else is going on, right? Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Candomblé, Santeria, humanism, right? Refusal of certain kind of religion, right? I'm interested in these kind of, right, these other religious possibilities that often are on the margins of discourse. There's a tendency, in addition to a tendency to privilege U.S. experiences of blackness as well as Protestant formations and expressions, there's a tendency to marginalize or even reject the contributions and complexities of African culture and thought. On the flip side, right, if there's a tendency to reject, the flip side is a tendency to essentialize and romanticize. In addition to the black religion, black church conflation, there's been a tendency to approach black religion through three dominant disciplines or frameworks. Theology, right, James Cone, Dolores Williams; history, someone like Al Rabbitoe, Evelyn Higginbotham; and social science from E. Franklin Frazier, C. Eric Lincoln. Right. My approach takes seriously these other disciplines and ways of framing black religion, but I engage and examine the notion and practice of black religion through literature, philosophy, and critical theory. So often I'm thinking about black religion through certain kind of thematics, right? Suffering, trauma, liberation, performance, right? And thinking about how those different themes get us to reflect on black religion or black piety, the very notion of black religion and black piety differently. So what does this all mean, right? So my research asks certain kind of questions. How might spaces, practices, and texts that exist at the edges or outside of religious institutions enable us to reimagine black people's pieties, impieties, and conceptions of the sacred? How might, for instance, different kinds of literary texts, slave narrative, autobiography, fiction, and critical essay, compel us to trouble, expand, and rediscover the very notion of black piety? In approaching black religion through literary genres, my research asks questions like, what is the relationship between race and religion, and how are they mutually constitutive? In other words, how have race and religion both been used to determine who counts and who does not count as human? How does the formation of black religious identity necessarily involve co-constitutive categories like gender, class, sexuality, citizenship, the human, settlement, etc.? How do themes like anguish, sacrifice, liberation, piety, remembrance, spirituality, embodiment, and the afterlife of slavery operate in literary expressions of black religiosity? Finally, how do popular expressions of black music across the diaspora, hip-hop, reggae, dancehall, perform the sacred in ways that interrupt tendencies to associate the sacred with purity, coherence, safety, transparency, and ultimately whiteness? So I've been developing, right, this is kind of what I'm trying to call something called the volatile sacred, right? My colleague J. Cameron Carter calls it the black sacred. I think there's a lot of overlap, right? Here I draw from Emile Durkheim's classic text, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, 1912 text, where he suggested there's actually, right, at the end of the text, he suggested there's two conceptions of the sacred at work in his analysis and his research. Well, he didn't do much of the research, but he was indebted to people who were in Australia. Right? He calls it the lucky and unlucky sacred, or the right hand and left hand sacred, right? The former conception names objects, ideas, and practices that provide a sense of security and protection. That's the conception of the sacred we usually associate with something that gives us a sense of communal identity, cohesion, security. The unlucky sacred names those dark forces and energies that taboos and prohibitions are often designed to prevent from contaminating spaces that are imagined as pure, right? these forces, sometimes labeled as profane, are actually set apart, which is the definition for the sacred for him, as dangerous, chaotic, and a threat to order. So for me, the volatile sacred gets at the ambivalence of the sacred, how the yearning for purity undermines itself. The sacred, according to Durkheim, Bataille, and others, exists at the edge of purity and contamination. This is Mary Douglas's term. Safety and danger, protection and vulnerability, and life and death. A couple more minutes? All right, okay. So two examples for me that help me think about this notion of the volatile sacred and how it might make interventions in certain kind of contemporary conversations are actually a moment in James Baldwin's 1963 text, Fire Next Time, right, where he's describing, right, a church worship, right. He at this point had left the Pentecostal church, but it hadn't left him to some, to some extent, right. He was he had a conversion experience early on. He was a junior pastor, right. But after, in addition to having next to having a at times scathing critique of Christianity, he suggests that there's no power like the power, right, of black worship and music, right? And even though he's talking about black church music, we know that throughout his corpus, he connects spirituals, gospel to jazz and blues. He even says in Many Thousands Gone, he starts that essay by saying that black people have only been able to tell their story through music, right? He's exaggerating, but there's some kind of truth to that, right? In Fire Next Time, he describes this intimate gathering and effervescence of black bodies worshiping together. This is a fraught space where shouting, crying, moaning, laughter, dance, and tambourines racing collide to enable an ecstatic experience, right? What I'm interested in is how music, these gathering of black bodies, and Baldwin's representation of this experience engenders a range of affects and emotions, anguish, despair, joy, pleasure, etc. And I'm wondering if this category of anguish, which is throughout his corpus, right, potentially, as a frame, not just as an affect, but as a trope, enables us to make certain interventions in contemporary conversations about optimism and pessimism, right? You guys might be familiar with this kind of subscription model, right? You have to be either optimist or a pessimist, right? But there's a way in which Baldwin's notion of anguish is always somewhere between and beyond maybe that binary, right? I'm also thinking about a scene in Toni Morrison's Beloved, the clearing scene, right, with Baby Suggs, right? Where Baby Suggs, she's described as an unchurched preacher, healer, conjurer, right? And she says, I'm not going to be talking to you about your sins, right? I'm going to talk to you, right? First of all, she exhorts, almost commands them to laugh, to cry, to dance, and these kind of things fused together. There's also a way in which there's a kind of gender crossing going on, men to be women, women to be men. But she suggests, right, this idea of loving the black flesh, right, loving flesh. We know that throughout that novel, right, the flesh is associated with, right, scars on Setha's back, right, which she calls a choke cherry tree, right, sexual assault, right. We connect this to Spiller's work, right. The flesh is associated with that which has the capacity to be ripped apart, torn, and divided, right. So I'm very much interested because if Baby Suggs is telling these black bodies to love the flesh, there's a sense in which she's kind of sacralizing black flesh in some way in response to the violence that's been inscribed on that flesh, that kind of hieroglyphics of the flesh. And for me, right, what that gestures toward is a notion of the sacred that's always already being traversed by, right, the traumatic, right, violence and brokenness, right. So the sacred is always already, right, rendered impure in a certain type of way because you're thinking about that, right, that history of the flesh being, that violence being inscribed on the flesh in a certain type of ways, right. So essentially in my work, what I want to suggest is, here are two examples. I also look at hip hop as well. Here are two examples where the notion of the sacred is being troubled and expanded in a certain type of way and allows us to see literature, in addition to other expressions, hip hop, film, and so forth, as sites to think about religion, to think about blackness, to think about black religion in very complicated and hopefully nuanced ways. Thank you.
I share, reiterate Anne Maria's comment. I hope that my brief comments don't do too much damage either to your sense of me as a scholar or to the comments that have come before that I did not hear. So my research is situated in a now decades-old body of historical literature that continues to creatively and fruitfully revisit, critique, and revise the body of scholarship that dominated the history of Black people in the academy for most of the history of the United States. I share with many of the scholars of this radical and revisionist work an interest in the history of class and class power and its manifestations from the local and national to the global and across time and space. Questions of race and the production of race, the management of race, the deployment of race as an instrument of surveillance and control are among the questions that have been at the forefront of my scholarship and the scholarship in which the work of scholars that I enjoin. My intellectual agenda thus represents a collaboration with scholars interested in the making of race as a social construct, and no less, the real work that race does across the globe. It is attuned intensely to the labor of engaging through the lens of time and space, the very processes by which race is made and remade as a product of particular historical moments, and also interested in the particular historical legacies this has generated. For me, this has meant an intimate engagement in thinking, for example, about the importance of attending to such matters as what kind of crop was grown, the demographic configurations of slave societies, the size of slave holdings at different moments, the forms of resistance, and in particular, the intellectual labor of enslaved women that informed the nature of their resistance. It has led me to be concerned with the differential impact of migration patterns across time. Because these things mattered, they mattered in shaping the diversity of Black life in tandem with evolutions in social structures. They mattered in thinking about the ability of enslaved people to constitute families and communities and build modes of resistance to practices of enslavement and to the larger political, religious, legal, social, and economic structures that buttress slavery everywhere. They mattered in terms of the process of emancipation and its uneven and violent unfolding in places as diverse as Haiti, Jamaica, Egypt, the US, Cuba, Brazil, Madagascar, and more. As a historian of slavery, I'm interested in the ways in which slavery and related forms of unfree or bonded labor fertilized capitalism's development, how they fueled networks of extraction and trade that penetrated deep into the interior of nation-states and continents, effectively erasing certain kinds of global boundaries and erecting new kinds, and also erecting certain kinds of global empires that trafficked in racism, that trafficked in the fictions and brutalities of paternalism, and their persistence into the 21st century. It is of no small matter that 6 of the top cotton-producing states in the United States were former slaveholding states. Slavery and racial capitalism marked the bodies of people of Native American, African, Asian, and Middle Eastern descent. It marked the bodies as well, we should not forget, of Europe's poor down into the 20th century, well demonstrating that laboring bodies could be repurposed for the needs of capitalism anywhere and everywhere. Thus, in this strict sense, my work is firmly grounded in a historiography that has long been thinking globally, nationally, and locally. So the question for me, as I thought about this conference, is what additional work is accomplished by renaming this work Global Blackness? How is it different from Pan-Africanism or any number of previous nomenclatures that have essayed to name structures of power that have dominated the globe for centuries? What does it have to say about the oppression of women whose control of their own bodies and the control of the bodies of their babies has, as one author put it, been a feature of every repressive regime on the planet? What does it have to say about the unmarked girls that go missing every day in this country and has now led to the creation of a task force in Washington, D.C. to find them? How is it different from the transnational and transatlantic approaches to slavery that scholars have been working through for decades that refuses analyses that view nation-states in isolation? Black as a country, Nikhil Singh wrote over a decade ago, More than 80 years ago, Du Bois wrote of, quote, white freedom as the goal of the world and black slavery as the path thereto. Decades ago, James Baldwin, for his part, kept the pressure on. And James Baldwin, for example, writing, when asked the question if he could say something about the black movement in the United States, he responded, quote, there is no black movement in the U.S. I know it looks as if there is one. There is, he said instead, a white movement in the United States and a black reaction to it. It would be better understood, Baldwin wrote, what I really want to say if we left alone the terms white and black and talked instead of Christians and Jews, for instance, or Germans and Jews, or Czechs and Russians. You cannot describe what has happened as a Czech movement, can you? What happened is a Czech reaction to Russian oppression. You cannot call what happened after they bombed and killed children at Sunday school a black movement. It was simply a manifestation of white power. Like all societies, the white society is also determined to protect themselves. Isn't that right? End quote. The concept of global blackness, as I understand it, and I don't fully, and I'm still learning, and this conference has given me an opportunity to think more deeply about it and to read about it, and for that I'm grateful. But as I understand it, the concept may be rather too blunt an instrument to account for the instability in the first instance of the category of race, and in the second instance, the instability of racial capitalism that takes, and it can take shape too often as an ideological trick or tricks. So I end with these questions. And these are serious questions for me as I move forward in my own work. And again, questions that I would not have given as much consideration to had it not been for this conference. What new avenues of inquiry or analysis does this analytical framework open up for all of us? I have just returned a few hours ago from a conference in which the question of the intellectual work of enslaved women was at the heart of the panel that I was on. Finding and recording this history is a project of not just the global, but the local. Black women who sued former slaveholders for child support after the Civil War were part of a global movement to own themselves and their children, part of a global movement for freedom, but they were also very much part of a very localized and often individualized movement against paternalism that sought justice in the courts of the United States. Part of a movement that built an intellectual apparatus to fight the local and to fight global trafficking in their bodies and in the bodies of their children. In the move to focus on the global, I do not want to lose sight of the everyday struggles for equal rights and justice, or the forces opposing them that determined who could live, who would live, and who would die, whether that was in the orange groves of Florida, or in the cotton and sugar fields of Louisiana, Mississippi, Haiti, Cuba, Colombia, or Brazil, or in the cannery factories of Chicago. I do not want to lose sight of Rose, a slave woman about whom I've written, a woman who fought Confederate forces, military forces in the low country of South Carolina. But Rose was never unaware of the global network of racial capitalism that placed one of her children on the auction block and that exploited her body to clothe the world. In sum, then, my work engages a long historiography that has exposed the genealogies of racism and race thought, and structured and built a world in the centuries before, during, and after the rise of slavery. Racism, as Stuart Hall argued, aims, quote, to dehistoricize, translating historically specific structures into the timeless language of nature, decomposing classes into individuals and recomposing those disaggregated individuals into reconstructed unities, the great coherences of new ideological subjects. It translates classes into blacks and whites, economic groups into people, solid forces into races. This is a process, he said, of constituting new historical subjects or ideological discourses that produces a naturalized racist subject. I aim in my work, finally, to not translate class into blacks and whites. Thank you.
I'm Tommy DeFrantz, and I'm acting as chair of African American Studies. I'm also a performance artist, and I tend to experience the world through the process of making work, or as prelude to making work. So I want to share something with you. Global Blackness, 5 movements. One. Brazil. Conference on Dance, Recife, 2013. I don't speak Portuguese. The event is organized by anthropologists from the north. We meet at a hotel in Orinda before the first day of the event. We sit in a circle. There are a couple of men and a dozen women. They are all white. I know this because I'm American. I grew up trained to see race and to calculate its implications in the moment. From the time I was, well, from before I was born. Once when I was 9, I was riding a bike with a white friend in Indianapolis, Indiana. Dusk. We happened upon a parade of Klansmen, white sheets and hoods, burning crosses and torches. We hid. We rode to his house. I knew to hide. I knew to see race. But back to Recife. I talked about Black beauty and concert dance, simultaneous translations. We tussled with the technology. Some Black people came to the talk, and we shared skin and a moment of deep quiet. An older man, especially, had clearly represented dance for so many for so long. He was beautiful. We had no common language, but we had dance, and we shared knowledge. I held his hand longer. He told me so many things in our silent exchange, but he couldn't tell me what I didn't already know. The next year, Sao Paulo, at an event to galvanize Black studies and a new Black arts movement, huge conference by my standards, 500 plus people, mostly very young, many speaking English. Again, the organizers are white. Invited guests from the US, Senegal, Cuba, Benin. First day, first speaker, me. No translations. I talk about circulations of Black social dance across the continent. Some interest, some curiosity. First question, why is a North American male the first speaker at our conference about Black arts in Brazil? I agree. I chastise the conference organizers for putting me first and spend the next 2 days listening without speaking. A great presentation on African retentions in the Bloco Afro from a researcher from Cuba. She speaks Spanish and enough Portuguese to slip through. The students insist that I comment on their creative work on the 3rd day, and on the 4th we dance together. I teach a section of a class. By this time, we are a much smaller Black group, wondering at our variety in motion. The older white people do not come to these classes. I don't know if they'd be welcome. Two, Austria. Teaching at the Impulse Tanz, an important old experimental performance art festival in Vienna. I teach a workshop on Afrofuturism and contemporary social justice movements. 25 students, maybe 15 are of color. The Black people see each other variously. They're from Helsinki, Brussels, Philadelphia, London, Congo. We speak English. One African doesn't speak much English, so we speak French, sometimes. We dance together. A young Black woman from Britain takes me aside to tell me that a white instructor has already commented on her hair and asked to touch it. This is 2015. White ignorance unbounded. Rudeness propels itself outward. Faustin Linyakula, the famous choreographer from Congo, is a friend. He and I are among the 6 black faculty for the festival, which has maybe 300 faculty teaching 12 hours a day across 4 weeks in 10 separate dance studios. Impulse is huge. 100,000 people participate in the festival each year. Faustin gathers the black people together at his apartment at the end of the first day. All 30 of us come to speak English and enjoy each other's assembly. We complain about the white people and their willful ignorance. Ismael Ivo, the black Italian man who founded the festival, comes by for a moment, and the room shifts. He tells us that we are the largest cohort of blacks ever assembled at the festival. We are all uncomfortable. He seems the most uncomfortable of all. The next week, a reception for faculty at a bar. The belligerent white Belgian choreographer approaches me drunk. He has to tell me. He doesn't see me as black. I consider this briefly. All week he's been race baiting, calling out provocative ethnic identifiers, and teasing propriety in the name of art without censorship, creating outside of race. He looms in my face. I don't see you as black. I respond, that's because you're an idiot. He kicks and screams and cries, this really happened. I chat briefly with another American choreographer, white of course. I was one of only 2 black American faculty at the festival that year, so far as I know. The problems we all live with follow us wherever we go, because we are still the people with the problems. Three, UK. Performance in a contemporary dance festival in Manchester, a talking piece with the title, I Am Black, You Have to Be Willing to Not Know. The piece is a dialogic manifesto that calls on its audience to participate in its formation, asking questions of the speaker and admitting how they are feeling as the work emerges among us. Here's one section of the work. We'll see ourselves in the spaces of contemporary performance. Well, not that often we don't see each other there, but when we do, we see each other and we notice each other. We notice each other because we are so few. And when we catch each other's eyes, we know this truth. We know that we are so few. Those of us who have arrived in this rarefied place where ideas are considered as important as the rent check. So let's start there, in this so-called mixed context where the audiences are overwhelmingly and almost exclusively white. Then there will be 3 of us among 50 or 15 among 500. But the thing about black is that we see each other. We're not invisible to each other. We see it. And that seeing may be a comfort, or it may be a time to pull away or towards, or it may be a sense that, well, at least I won't be the only one who has to see whatever crazy shit is going to happen on stage that will be racially awkward. But sometimes it's more like, okay, there's somebody else here, so maybe we'll actually have to deal with whatever it is we're about to see. None of us want that dealing part. It's just really, really hard having to deal with racism staged as social diversion or as an artistic choice. So instead, we might smile or nod or turn away quickly. We pretend we're not there, but we always know we're here, always knowing is part of what it is to be in the place of being black. Yes, I am black, and yes, I pretty much always know it. But sometimes I get tired and I have to come off the floor. That line comes from Colored Girls. It's from one of the love poems. And that line speaks to me because so often I have this thing that I call white fatigue. And yes, it's a thing. And yes, every black person has it at some point when we just can't stand to have to talk to another white person now. Not now. This is a real thing. This really happens, and it's because in the relationship of white privilege to blackness, there's this overwhelming sense of need and expectation, and to understand how to be in relationship to, and to ask questions without an answer, and to try to be close. To want, because we need these things, and we think we need these relationships, but the timing is off sometimes. And while I want to be at the performance, I just don't want to have to explain myself and my blackness to you right now. I don't want to have to explain that I'm sad that there's only 3 of us here, and that I know them both already, the other 2, or that I don't know them, but I know one of them is a child looking for herself in the world and not sure how to deal with the fact of her own blackness. Because we have to learn how to deal with it. And there's no instruction book, but there are regulations, codes, there are expectations, and there are things that one can and one cannot do. Now, some of you white people listening to this are my friends, and please do know that this friendship is a real thing. You know good and well that this white fatigue isn't about you, not always, and that our friendship is like any other. At times it needs to be reset, maybe for an hour, maybe for a day, or maybe for a month. We're not talking about an impossibility of deep friendship finally honed. But still, sometimes that thing arises anyway, when Black possibility emerges, and you and I see it too differently. Your eyes narrow and you shift nervously back and forth and you stammer and you stammer and you look to see how I will respond as your friend who knows you and whom you know generally, or as a Black person who will support the possibility of the group. What choice do I have? Both circumstances are real. They both matter. Can you try to not make me choose? I actually know you're my friend when you refuse to make me choose. What does that mean? We can never talk about the work, the Black work that you don't like, the Black possibility that makes you nervous. Maybe it means you have to listen more than you might with your white friends. You have to learn to listen and not speak. You so like to talk, to weigh in. Do you know how to listen? After this section, I ask the audience how they feel. An older white lady says, "I feel shut down." A young Black woman says, "I feel affirmed." We try to hold the space Black. We can never hold it for long. Four, Trinidad. A feast during the week of independence celebrations. We ride 45 minutes in a small van to a site outside the town at 2 a.m. We cross someone's backyard to get to the ceremony space, a small open-air cement patio with room for maybe 50. There are various stools and seats for 10. We are about that number and don't consider sitting, of course. We are mostly North American Black, but there are 2 whites, of course, college students, of course, who found their way into the group. The ceremony goes on for a couple of hours with sermons, I guess, I don't understand the language, singing, testifying, and a devotional performer who passes through the space variously dancing and calling down the spirits. We are a loud group at 3 a.m., and I always sing along. It reminds me of Church of God in Christ services, with ecstatic conjuring and young women touched to speak in tongues and dance out of themselves. When the devotional performer enters the space with a turtle on her head, I give in to the unlikeliness of the exchange. Black time stretches on. I'm home by 6 a.m., drenched with deliverance, as I would have been if I had gone to the nightclub instead. .505, USA, San Francisco. I'm 15 years old taking West African dance taught by Dolores Caillou, one of the architects of Black student uprisings at San Francisco State and San Francisco City colleges. We are maybe 30 in the room, 3 male drummers, I think, 25 women or so, and me. There's always a me in these classes, a queer kid dancing with the women, trying to keep up, trying to learn how to hold space. We're warming up before class proper. Caillou walks among us, touching some of us on the arm. Did she touch me? I follow the movement of the group. Some of us are going out of the studio and into an office that I never noticed before. We're in a community center in a strange part of town, but here we are on a Saturday morning. Fine Black people, mostly women in their 20s and 30s, some older like Caillou, some whites. Movement towards the office. Many are going, unsure. Another touch on my arm. Now I follow. In the room, the door shuts. We are all Black. Caillou speaks. These are our dances, and this is our time, something like this. We can make space for the others, but do we have to? Something like this. They will take our dances, and they will take the jobs teaching us about us in the schools, something like this. Self-determination and dancing towards our own joy, something like this. Dancing towards our own joy, something like this.